Welcome back to another episode of Dialogue with Dylan, where my goal is to promote honest and empathetic conversations. This episode will be a little bit different. There's going to be no guest or conversation, but rather a brief message that I wanted to share. And I'm thinking about starting a series that will focus on a particular word and we'll just explore the meaning of it. And I thought that I'd start with impartiality, since that has been on my mind recently. We live in a world where impartiality and fairness in general have become almost controversial and rebellious. I mean, what would you expect, given the fact that we live in a binary system of beliefs? There are usually two primary stances that you can have on a certain issue, politically speaking, religiously, scientifically, and so on. And society tells us that we have to pick a side, and any deviance from that set of beliefs held by our affiliated side is frowned upon. And holding incompatible views is simply unacceptable. Asking questions about the obvious is ridiculed, and skepticism is belittled. These are major problems and misconceptions that are rarely discussed, and it's wreaking havoc upon our discourse, our communication, and therefore our functionality as people, in my opinion at least. And this past year has only made it worse. And just spending a minute on these social media platforms makes this very evident. And I honestly don't understand how people can be so close-minded and think that they know everything. I'll be absolutely upfront and admit that I don't know everything. I'm not an expert on every issue. And I think it takes a lot to acknowledge that in this day and age. And I'd encourage you to do that as well. I really make an effort to be an informed person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have or will ever have everything figured out completely. We have to resist the temptation to confine ourselves in these toxic media echo chambers. And I talked about this in the short film on ignorance that I released last fall. And I really believe that we wouldn't be so left-wing or so right-wing if we simply exposed ourselves to the opposition more regularly, instead of being constantly fed these distorted glimpses of the other side, often taken out of context by our own side. Not always, but most of the time I would say that's the case. I'm so sick and tired of hearing each side sing in unison and bark at each other whenever there's a tragedy or any sort of controversy. Just condemn evil when you see it and try to be morally consistent. If you're opposed to violence or political violence, then condemn all of it. If you oppose dictatorship, authoritarianism, racism, you need to condemn all of it regardless of political convenience. Don't just cherry pick different instances just because it makes you or your own side appear superior to the other. Someone with a dissenting worldview shouldn't be viewed as your adversary, but rather an imperfect human being that you can learn from. One sort of rebuttal to that way of thinking is that, you can't disagree on that sort of thing. It's if someone disagrees with you on something that you deem to be a human right, of course there's a lot of passion that would be released from you, and it would lead you to be a bit more hostile in your approach to settling that argument. But I would argue that showing respect and empathy is always going to be the best method of persuasion. Just try to be the more mature person in the interaction. If you consider, there's a very high probability that someone walking past you on the sidewalk disagrees with you on a fundamental issue. I'd encourage you to just try and prove yourself wrong. Challenge your own beliefs. Now, of course, there are certain issues where you're either wrong or you're right. When it comes to racism or equality, to quote that Michael Jackson song, the black or white, you're either wrong or you're right. And of course, I would say that that is obviously true. When it comes to racism, you're either wrong or you're right, and many other common sense issues. But I think that a lot of people are misrepresented as, or they'll be denounced as something that they're not. So I think you really need to understand who you're dealing with and who you're criticizing before you make an accusation or a remark, or accusing someone of being something horrible, like a racist, for example, or something along those lines. You really have to understand their argument, because I see an awful lot of people being misrepresented. There are plenty of intelligent people on both sides of these issues that you can learn from. And most of us won't do this. Like I said, we won't expose ourselves to opposing news sources, and we don't diversify our media. It requires an awful lot of discipline. And I would argue that most views that those in government, the people that we look up to, most views that they possess are purely motivated by power and control, not by democracy or the Constitution. That's the case for the filibuster, the Electoral College, the voting age, voting laws, court packing, statehood, etc. These are all mechanisms that can be tweaked to gain a political advantage. And both parties are very power hungry right now. And they will brand a lot of these proposals as, defending democracy or the Constitution, or, these labels that are impossible to disagree with. But the underlying motivation is power. We don't have to be loyal to these people. I try not to be so naive to think that these people in power have our best interests in mind. Most don't, and that notion doesn't really see political boundaries. The hunger and greed that often helps people achieve power is completely irrelevant to your needs as an individual. There might be some outliers, but in general, most people in power are bought and paid for by someone else pulling the strings. The reason I say this is that, like I said, we don't need to value loyalty to specific politicians or, public figures. We don't need to accept or reject what someone says simply because of the letters in parentheses next to their name and whether or not it corresponds to your voter registration. We desperately need more free-thinking and independent minds that aren't tethered to external influences or prominent figures, but rather people that are unafraid to seek out truth beyond these forces that demand conformity, loyalty, and submission. We need people that aren't afraid to laugh at their own side or acknowledge that they were wrong. We need people that put in the work to chisel away at their beliefs so that they're robust and can withstand great storms of criticism. I'll never be ashamed to continually preach this. If we strive to be better thinkers in that regard, then I really see a bright future. But until then, I can only try and be optimistic and get that message out there, thus being my reasoning for recording this for you today. I hope that you'll ponder all of this for a moment, like I've been for a while. And again, this is only my 2 cents, and I greatly appreciate you listening. And I'd also love to hear your feedback on this as well. Take care.